I'm Zeynep Coşkun, Research Fellow at Al-Sharq Forum. Today we are in DC for an event we are organizing on Sykes-Picot. What Sykes-Picot mean after 100 years for the Middle East. And I have with me a very distinguished guest, managing editor of TRT World. Welcome, Mr. Rasul Serdar.
Nice to see you.
It's great to have you here with us with Al-Sharq. But post Sykes-Picot, we want to talk with you today more about Syria and the improvements that are happening, especially in northern Syria with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Can we say that the US is engineering a new opposition in Syria through Syrian Democratic Forces?
Yeah, it's not a secret anymore, actually. You know that we have just recently heard about the Syrian Democratic Forces, which the main component actually is YPG, the PKK Syrian offshoot. So YPG now have full support from the USA in terms of supplying the weapons, in terms of supplying the intelligence, logistics, and mapping as well. And even, you know, that there are more than 200 of the US troops actually on the ground, not for battle, but for advisories. And some of them are taken actually at the very front lines of the YPG as well. Yes, US is engineering a new opposition in Syria. Democratic Syrian Forces, which is defined by the USA, actually the liberal front of the liberal or democratic front of the Syria, because the USA has a history of the supporting to the proxies, especially the Afghanistan war. After the Soviet invasion has been a huge lesson for the USA. During the Soviet invasion in the Afghan war, US has supported the Mujahideens, I will say, like the Muslim fractions in the Afghanistan that were at that time fighting against Soviet Unions. But later, we have seen that fractions, some of them have been turned to Al-Qaeda and some of them turned to become like Al-Taliban or the other fractions that actually started to fight against the US interest in Afghanistan. So most probably the American policymakers thinking that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether they are hardliners, whether they are moderates or whatever, in any way, supporting the Islamists has always a potential for the future that they can threat American interest, so that their weapons can return to the American interest in the regions. So that this always has been like a kind of, I will say, subconscious in the mind of the US policymakers. And that is why for the last 4 years, I will say since 2000, at the beginning, from the beginning of 2011 to the beginning of 2015, for that whole 4 years, Americans have promised a lot to the Syrian opposition, which is recognized by the international community, especially the USA. They promised them a lot to supply them with the stringers or manpads or some of the conventional weapons to fight against the Syrian regime or against its brutal actions. But these weapons had never been delivered. Never. Whenever I met as a journalist, when I was meeting one of the seniors of the Syrian opposition, they were telling me that actually within a couple of months, the Americans are going to supply us the conventional weapons that will be stronger against the regime. But it has never happened. On the other hand, we have seen that especially after the Kobani siege that has been conducted by ISIS, the US almost unconditionally and so generously started to weaponize the YPG, PKK Syrian offshoot. So why? The reason is that actually US has that subconscious as well, that if they weaponize the Islamists, at the end of the day, when the war is over, these weapons can target the US interests in the region. And there's only one group that does not stand such a possibility, that one day their weapons would target the US interests in the region, and that is PKK.
But can we say that because as someone from Turkey, you have a better understanding of how PKK function, and PKK always has been very, I would say, jealous of any other faction that it would need to share power with. They're trying to now get the Arabs into SDF, but we know that PKK in general will work on the demographics of the region and will work on the factions and that's just also going to be another political suicide for the US in the long run.
For the long run, it's going to create definitely. There are two of the complications for the US. First, by weaponizing PKK, which is operating in Turkey, and for the last 8 months, PKK has killed more than 500 Turkish security personals. The US policy now is creating a vacuum that actually, on the other hand, is creating the feeling or a trust issue between the US traditional allies in the region and the US itself. Now Turkey has a trust issue with the USA. Because of the Iranian talks, Saudi Arabia has trust issue with the USA. Because of the Iranian talks, Israel has a trust issue with the USA and so on. So for the long term, this trust issue, this inconsistency is definitely going to create a very suspicious relationship between the US and US traditional allies in the region. This is one of the complications or one of the disadvantages for the long term in the US policy. And secondly is that PKK now is operating behind its natural borders. Think of Al-Hasaka. The Hasaka's demographic, if you look at Hasaka's demographic structure, you will see that from 65 to 70% of them is Arab populations, but now it's fully under the control of the YPG, which is a Kurdish faction, a very sectarian Kurdish faction. Or look at Tel Abyad. It is historically a Sunni Arab populated place, a city. Now it's under the control of YPG. And now YPG is extending to the north of Aleppo, which is highly dominated by the Arab population and so on. So for the long term, this is going to create actually deeper crises and conflicts. For now, it's operational for the USA because in terms of hierarchy and disciplines and so on, it's fine. But for the long term, it's definitely going to create a deeper and even I will say that a harsher conflict in the region. It's not a solution. So excluding your traditional allies is the first problem, and second problem, this on the ground is not going to work for the long term because a group that you are opening a space for that's actually historically and geographically it doesn't match with the reality.
And where does Russia comes into play here? So it looks like the US and Russia has agreed on template for Syria, and they've been working together. And there doesn't seem much difference of opinion there, which is very interesting to follow.
For the US, I will say that look, for the first year of the crisis, USA actually pretended as if it has a Syrian policy. By saying this, I'm not alone to say that, by the way. You have heard about Chuck Hagel. He was the former defense minister of the USA. So at one of his interviews, Chuck Hagel said actually, by the way, being Minister of Defense in the USA is something big because they manage annually about $700 billion, which is a huge money. Huh? Chuck Hagel at one of his interviews says that actually when there was a press conference during my post, I was most scared of the questions about Syria because as the defense minister of the USA, I had to pretend that as if we have a Syrian policy. But in this planet, there was only one guy actually that knew what's our Syrian policy, President Obama. But he has never talked to us about what actually he is thinking about Syria. So even Chuck Hagel himself was saying that once I was briefing President Obama about Syria, but President Obama was playing with his BlackBerry and yawning, and even I was not sure whether he's listening to me or not. So let's see that actually US does not have a Syrian policy. US now sees the Syrian policy as a security problem. So that's why if you look at the US policymakers, they're always talking about ISIS, but they do not go to the root causes of the problems. Just imagine, how it happened. the people demands for change, and then the revolution started in Syria. But now we are talking about ISIS, which is just a security problem. U.S. is clear about fighting against ISIS, but it does not have another vision for the future in Syria. I think Russians
expect the opposition to fight
Yes.
ISIS instead of regime, while the opposition started with fighting against the regime.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And Russians, for the 4 years, Russians also, as the rest of the world, they thought that the USA has actually a policy, and they waited for that. They were very careful before their actions. Then finally, I think Putin and his team realized that actually Obama's administration is never going to take a groundbreaking action in Syria, and this gap is always going to be there. And Russia decided to infiltrate that vacuum, and they intervened into they got involved in Syria with conventional weapons. If you look at the Russians' military deployments, it's like a state in a fight, in a war with another state. We are talking about 52 aircrafts, we are talking about cruise, we are talking about long-range missiles, and so on. So Russians, I will say, that actually conducted a coup against the USA in Syria. And even the Americans were not expecting for that. Not any of the regional countries as well. Once Russians got there so heavily, then the US had no choice but to accept Russians' existence there. And so there was two options: to have a confrontation with Russians or to cooperate with that. Since Obama's policy is definitely not being confrontational, because Obama's administration does not adopt a confrontational policy in the Middle East, so they cooperated with Russia. It was not a planned cooperation, but it was a kind of like a de facto situation that Americans had to accept this coup. One of the senior Syrian opposition leaders actually told me, look, whenever we meet Secretary General John Kerry, he's always talking about what Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, is telling us. It was even like John Kerry seems to us like as if he's the messenger of Lavrov for us, because Russians have a clear vision about what they want to do in Syria, but the US, except fighting ISIS, they do not have a clear vision. So in this case, Russians are much more militarily involved and ready to fight, but Americans just are ready to fight ISIS, but they do not have any other vision to confront or whatever. That's why I'm saying that it was not a planned cooperation, but because of the Russians' immediate intervention, Americans had to accept this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rasul,
Thank you for having
joining us today and for your insightful conversation.
Thank you for having me.